Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 to 21. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife from him from Egypt.
We have in this passage a story of great joy and a story of great sadness. The story of a baby born after years of waiting, the sadness of a family broken by petty quarrelling and jealousy. In the first part of the story, in verse 1, we see grace. Abraham is described as a man of great faith. We have seen something of what this has meant in our previous studies on the life of Abraham. But it is not because of this faith or because Abraham and Sarah were deserving in any other way. The child is born by an act of God's grace. It is the undeserved favour of God. God has kept his promise to Abraham and Sarah. In verse 2 we see that God keeps his promises in his own time, which is always perfect. The naming of the child in verse 3, we see Abraham being obedient to God. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 years old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. We see within the naming and the circumcision the fact that Abraham is obedient. Obedience is a natural reaction to the recognition that we have been blessed by God. And verses 6 to 8 show us that joy is infectious. When we are blessed, we want everybody to rejoice with us. This is the happy part of the story, worth just dwelling on for a few minutes. This promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah that they would bear a son is fulfilled. It isn't fulfilled because Abraham and Sarah were more deserving in some way than other people. It isn't fulfilled because they are really good people or anything like that. It is fulfilled because God promised it and God is gracious. We have seen through our studies in the life of Abraham all sorts of ways in which he has been disobedient, as well as ways in which he has been faithful. We have seen him do things which would lead you to believe that he lost trust in the promise. If it hadn't been for the fact that he lost trust in the promise of God, there wouldn't be the problem in the latter part of this chapter with Ishmael. We see in studies that we had before about how he says to Sarah, "Say that you're my sister rather than my wife," and how this puts at peril the idea that Abraham and Sarah together will share in this promise of God. It's brought about by God's grace. It's brought about because God, in his infinite love, promised this and made it happen. And that in itself is a lesson for all of us. It's a lesson about the grace of God. It's a lesson which says not that we are deserving of God's blessing. In fact, just the opposite, that we are not deserving of God's blessing, but God blesses us anyway. God comes and honours his promises. He blesses us in all sorts of different ways because of his grace. And when we find ourselves being blessed by God, and most of us, if we just stopped and thought about it for a moment, most of us, if we just thought about it for a moment, would actually be able to work out a whole number of ways in which we are blessed. In fact, we used to sing the chorus, didn't we? Count your blessings, name them one by one, and you will be surprised what God has done. It's worth doing every now and then. It might not be that worth singing the chorus, but it's worth actually doing the counting of your blessings now and then, and just seeing what God has done. And as we count our blessings, we can rejoice in that. We can rejoice in the fact that our lives have been blessed by God. And as we rejoice in it, so it is that others can join in that rejoicing as well. I said this morning that when I was a young Christian, part of most services that I went to involved somebody giving their testimony. It was a regular occurrence within church that people gave their testimony. We tend only to hear testimonies nowadays on those days when people are being baptized. But I think it's a good thing to remember that God is blessing us and to share that with each other. And as we share it with each other, so it becomes infectious and that we rejoice with each other. In the first church where I was ministered, on the church anniversary, we would have an open service. Open in the sense that everybody could take part, and everybody, as John said this morning, volunteered to take part. And people would get up one after the other in the church and say what God had been doing in their lives that year. They would talk about how God had blessed them. And I think it's one of those things that we need to get back to, is sharing with each other the fact that God is blessing our lives and rejoicing together about that. Such things become infectious. You go to a service where people are joyful and you find that joy being infectious and taking over everybody. It's a happy time in that sense. And not everything that we share, of course, will be about the fact that God has blessed us in that way. Some of the things that we share may be of sadness, but we can pray for each other. And the other reaction to counting our blessings is not only that we share them and we rejoice in them, but that it leads us to obedience. It leads us to walk in the right way. Because we understand that by walking in the right way, we are blessed. And if we don't walk in the right way, we find that the blessings that we knew are no longer there. In the words of an old hymn, where is the blessedness I knew when first I walked with Christ? That's not quite the right words, but it's something like that. We need to continue in our Christian walk to find those blessings day by day. Our response to God's blessing our life is a response of obedience. But that's the good part of the story, the happy part of the story. Let's take a brief look at the sad part, the next bit. Ishmael had had his nose put out of joint. As the only son, he must have hoped for an inheritance and the place in the family accorded to the only son. Ishmael would have known about the promise. It wasn't something that was held as a secret. But Ishmael would have looked at his father, 100 years old. He would have looked at Sarah, 90 years old, and have thought to himself, they're never going to have another son. I'm going to be the heir. He must have thought like that. He had his nose put out of joint when Isaac was born. And it says that he mocked. Doesn't give us any explanation of that. It simply says, but Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. Notice that. She doesn't even name him. In fact, the whole passage, Ishmael, I don't think is named at all. Gives some kind of idea of how the writer at least thought about this. But it says that he was mocking. It doesn't give us any indication as to what form that took. But it was a form that certainly annoyed Sarah. Sarah is annoyed by the attitude of Ishmael and by implication with that of Hagar, and tells Abraham that she wants rid of both of them. Sarah, the recipient of God's grace, shows very little grace in her dealing with Hagar and Ishmael. And it tells us that Abraham is distressed by all of this. He's distressed by it. After all, Ishmael is his son, being brought up in his household. Abraham had a love for him. He's distressed by the fact that he's going to have to send him away. And so he prays about it. Always a good thing to do when you've got a difficult decision to make is to spend some time praying and see what God has to say into the situation. He doesn't just do as Sarah said to do. Sarah says, get rid of them. He doesn't do that. He goes away and he prays about it. And God speaks to him and tells him to do as Sarah wishes and gives Abraham another promise. A promise which says that he will look after Ishmael. And Abraham gives them some provisions and sends them on his way. It says, early next morning Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. I read this and I thought to myself, what on earth is going on? Abraham, we know from the story so far, is one of the richest men around. He has, within his household, mainly slaves, over 300 people. He can raise a small army when it's required, as we learnt earlier on. His herds and his flocks are so great that when Lot was travelling with him, there weren't enough pasture land and water to feed them. And yet when he sends Sarah and Ishmael away, he doesn't give them very much. He gives them a bag of food and a wineskin of water and sends them off. And you would think, under the circumstances, he could have been a little bit more generous. He could maybe have given them a donkey to carry these things, maybe a few slaves to help them along the way. He was a rich man, a wealthy man, yet they seem to be left with little provision. Doesn't give us an explanation as to why that was. You could take the generous view that Abraham believed in God's promise, and that he trusted that God would look after Ishmael and Hagar. Or maybe he thought, as he sent them off into the desert, that would be the end of the matter, and he would never hear or see from them again. And as the story goes on, we see that these provisions that Abraham has given to Hagar and to Ishmael run out, and Hagar finds a shady place about a bow shot away from Ishmael and lays down there ready to die and to allow her son to die. And it's then that we see that God intervenes. God intervenes when it matters. Doesn't intervene any earlier in the story. He intervenes at the point where Hagar has nowhere else to turn. He intervenes at the point where he is needed. And he opens Hagar's eyes and she finds a well. And we see then from there how it is that Ishmael grows and becomes the nation that he becomes. I said when we were looking at the beginning part of the story, the happy part of the story, that God fulfills his promises in his own time. He does it when it is at the right time, at the best time. And that is what we see in this part of the story as well. Hagar must realize in her extremity that it's God that has done this work. Whereas if it had been a bit earlier, she may have thought of all sorts of other explanations. I often find it interesting when I'm talking to people who, in difficult circumstances, say that they prayed. These are not necessarily people that come to church, not necessarily people who believe, not necessarily Christians, but because they find themselves in a difficult time, they prayed. And they get an answer to their prayers, and then when they're telling you about it, they give you all sorts of explanations as to how this happened, rather than the fact that it was God answering their prayers. They don't see the connection between the two. Here, God answers at the right time, and you can see the connection between what he has promised and what he does. God intervenes in the situation, and as he does so at that point of necessity. And what are the real lessons that we have to learn today from what in one sense is a happy story and in another sense is a very sad story? What are the lessons for us today? Well, the first one is to look at what created the problem. The problem that was created was the birth of Ishmael. The birth of Ishmael is a result of the scheming of Abraham and Sarah and their lack of trust in the promise of God. And it's true that the sins of the fathers in this sense are visited on the sons, because had Abraham and Sarah trusted God, none of the problems for Ishmael, either in this story or in future parts of the Old Testament account, would ever have happened. When we walk in our own way, when we do our own thing, when we trust in our own devices instead of trusting in God, the consequences of that are much wider than they are just for ourselves. That's one of the lessons of this passage. I think the opposite is also true, actually, is when we are obedient to God and we walk in his ways, the blessings to other people are greater than we will ever know. But the two things work together. The problem arises because of Abraham and Sarah's lack of trust and their own scheming. That's the first lesson for us. The second lesson is about a gracious God, a God who keeps his promises. Not because Abraham and Sarah were deserving, not because of any goodness within them, but simply because God keeps his promises and God shows unfailing love towards his children. There are over 1,000 promises in the Bible, and God keeps them all. And we can rely on those promises. When God says that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst, it is true. God is with us. When Jesus, named Emmanuel, God is with us, came into the world, the promise is true. God is with us, never leaves us. We can look through the promises of Scripture and God is faithful to them. Not because we are a faithful people, not because we are deserving, but because God is gracious and he gives to those people who are undeserving. And finally, our response to all of this is the response of joy and obedience. To be joyful at what God has done for us. I find it difficult since I've moved here not to be joyful on lots of occasions. Can I leave my house, I drive down the road and I am surrounded by the grandeur of the Welsh countryside. I see the greenery and the hills. Going the other way, you get the occasional glimpses of mountains. And I find it difficult not to feel joyful and blessed by this. But we ought to be feeling that about so much of our lives. As I said earlier, if we count our blessings, we will find joy in what God is doing for us. Our response to God in all of this is to be joyful and to be obedient. Because if we're obedient, we shall be blessed by God. And others will be blessed through our lives. Whereas if we are disobedient, we will find ourselves drifting away. We'll find ourselves losing that sense of peace and joy. And we'll often find that as we lose that, that has an implication to other people and not just to us. There is a really happy story here of a couple who for years have longed for a child and find that they have a son, Isaac. And there's a really sad story about the way a family is broken up because of the situation that arises. And in it all, there are lessons for us today. Lessons about trust and obedience. Lessons about grace. Lessons about joy. Let's remember just how God has blessed us and rejoice in that. Amen.